begin from here. The sugya, so right, as you know, or as you may know, there is no Masechet Chanukah, right? There isn't any special Masechet devoted to Chanukah. One of several topics that the Mishnah doesn't deal with directly. Chanukah, I believe, is only mentioned once in the Mishnah, in Mishnah and Baba Kama, and it's agav orche. It's just it's not even really in the adin of Chanukah per se.
Shel, is this במה מדליקים את Shabbat Eve?
Yes.
In the office?
Yes. So of course we're noheg to say the whole parak of Bameh Madlikin on Leil Shabbat, and the sugya of Chanukah comes in the wake of the first Mishnah. So what we're going to do tonight, we're going to look at the first Mishnah, and then we're going to look at a couple of things along the way, and then we're going to look at the sugya of Chanukah to see why it's brought here and how it relates, and what's at least one of the basic dinim of Chanukah. So yes, so this is a Mishnah you're all familiar with, and I'm not sure how familiar are you with it in terms of explaining what it means, so we'll just do a quick explanation. Bameh madlikin and bameh ein madlikin. Okay, so the first parak of Shabbat, and actually, of course, it begins famously with the isur of ha'avra on Shabbat, right, of passing something from one reshut to another reshut. But then right after that, the rest of the parak deals with Erev Shabbat. And then when we come to Bameh Madlikin, so now, as it were, we're at the end of Erev Shabbat. We're just about to go into Shabbat. And so we want to know about lighting candles for Shabbat. So this is Bameh Madlikin and Bameh Ein Madlikin, right? So what do we light Shabbos candles, or what do we light Shabbos lights with, and what don't we light Shabbos lights with? So it says Ein Madlikin lo belechesh velo bechosen velo bechalach velo b'tilat ha'idan velo b'midbar velo birokash al pnei hamayim. So all of these things, the Gemara, interestingly, a lot of the sugya, and we're not going to do most of the sugya here. The Gemara here, as is commonly the case, deals with what all of these things are, right? So in other words, these were terms that were used at the time of the Mishnah, and not all of them were obvious by the time of the Gemara. So the Gemara has to go through and explain each of them. But what we'll see is this list that we read up to now, these are things that would to make a wick for a menorah, for a lamp. And then it continues v'lo b'zefet v'lo b'sha'ava v'lo b'shemen kik v'lo b'shemen sreifa v'lo yav v'lo b'chelet. So all of these things are things that would be used for fuel. So we started off by we asked, what do we light with and what don't we light with? So we started to answer the question by the second part first. In other words, first we're saying these are the things you don't light with. Nachum Amadi Omer Madlikin b'chelev mevushal v'chachamim marmim mevushal v'echad she'eno mevushal ein madlikbo. So Nachum said that you can light with I guess it would be rendered fat, like cooked fat. And Chachamim say whether it's cooked or whether it's not cooked, you're not allowed to light with it. So first, so quickly, so what are all of these things? So Rashi Rashi says asor ptilah. What do we light with to make a wick? Kol hanitamat nitin mefaresh b'Gemara. All of these things in the Mishnah are Gemara. So Rashi's explaining why he's not telling you what all of them mean, because that's the sugya of the Gemara, and he'll explain them there. And then lo b'zefed lo b'shava, lovely inyan ptila. So this part is not about the wick. El latet bimkom shemen. These are things you give in place of oil. To Rashi, obviously, oil is something that you light with. Why would we think that oil is something obviously light with?
It is actually specified. Well, it's specified in. Well, it's specified for the menorah in the Heichal, and
Yeah.
so yeah.
In other words, so we know. In other words, we know at the very least that shemen zai is something that apparently used for lighting a lamp. Gemara is going to talk about that. Basically, with the structure of the sugya is here first is going to go through and explain what all of these things are. And then it's going to bring up the question about whether or not you can use these things for lighting the menorah in the mikdash. And then it's going to ask the question about whether or not you can use these things to light Hanukkah candles. So that's how Hanukkah gets into this sugya. So what are all of these things? So just please. We'll look at the Bartanura here. Loba lechesh. So what's lechesh? Kamin semer yesh ba'eres bein aklipa le'etz v'karui lechesh. Right. So there's a kind of a wool, I think called bast in English. It's an obscure word, right? But it's the fiber that's in a cedar tree that's between the bark and the wood, the wood of the tree itself, and that's called lechesh. Chosen is pishtan she'eno menupatz. It's uncombed flax. Chalach is a shalmeshi. It's the waist silk. So I didn't have time to try to figure all this out because the Gemara talks a lot of silk in different ways, that silk and things that were, I guess, either part of the processing. I don't know. There are different things that were made from different parts of. So this is the waste of silk, and I honestly don't know exactly what that means. B'ptilata idan, that's kamin semer yesh ba'arava ben aklipa le'etz. So that's the bast of a willow tree, right? So between the bark of the tree, the willow, you also have some kind of fiber. And ptilata midbar, esev aroch shegodlino tamamadlikim bahem. Right, it's the leaves of a long grass that they ate them, and they were used for lighting. Used them for lighting. Hamayim, not with the green that's on the face of the water. So that's also kamin semesh gadel b'dafnei hasfina sheshahata zman merubah b'mayim. It's a kind of a wool that grows on the sides of a ship. That has dwelled, that has stayed a long time.
This is algae. Must be algae.
Well, so the thing is algae, does algae a fiber?
I think it is when it dries out. I think it is fibrous.
Okay, maybe.
Yeah.
I honestly don't know. I didn't each of these things, even though I have to tell you, Mishnah many times, and to my neglect, I've never really gone deeply into all of the things. So I'm not sure if it's algae, but it's something that grows specifically, that attaches itself to ships. And it's not barnacles, right? Because that wouldn't be the same thing. But it's some kind of a growth that attaches itself to ships, and it's fiber. And in other words, so what's the point? All of these things, in principle, have a fiber-like aspect, and you might think then that you could use them as wicks. But the Mishnah prohibits them for use on Shabbat, and we'll see why. So the Bartanur explains Mikam Psul Shmanim, right? And the Gemara also explains this, that beginning with Zephet, we're talking now of fuels. Lo bezefet v'lo b'sha'ava, shelo yitain zefet names, v'sha'avad nitechet baner b'mkom shemen v'yadlik. You shouldn't put to pitch or to wax in a lamp instead of oil and light it. אבל לעשות כמין פתילה ארוכה שרגילים לעשות משעבה שרי, but to make a long stem like we are accustomed to do out of oil, out of wax, so that's an interesting point which we won't delve into. Rashi, he's Rashi here in the Sugya, because when you read this, like, you would be surprised that you're not allowed to use wax to make Shabbos candle, and we'll be surprised because it's a common thing that we use. So what the Bartanur is saying here, based on Rashi, is that's why he says you're not allowed to take the wax and melt it into a lamp. So you know the way the ancient lamps, it was like a little cup that had a spout and that had a top, right? You lift the top, you put in the oil, and then you would put the wick and lay them out on the spout. So they wanted to and what kind of wax are they talking about? From the Gemara, it seems that they're talking about beeswax, specifically beeswax. So in order to defend the minhag that people did use wax, it was commonly used. They're saying, so Rashi says that when you make candles out of wax, they're like long things, they are more like, what he wants to say is that they are like the wick itself. They become like the wick. It's a little difficult square, but we'll leave it at that. V'lo b'shem and keep.
But by that rationale, tea lights would be much more of a problem.
Well, I thought about that, and the tea lights and the quartzite lights also, but yeah, the tea lights might be problematic based on this, but we're gonna leave that as a question for the time being. Below b'shem and kik. So there's a machloket in the Gemara about what shem and kik is. We may take a quick look at it. Some people say that kik was a kind of a bird, and it was the fat from that bird. People say, well, here, I'll read you what the bird says. לא בשמן קיק, שמן היוצא מגרעינים שבתוך הצמר גפן שקוראים cotton. Some people say that it's cottonseed. So not, in other words, you wouldn't be allowed to use cottonseed oil. Say it's the kikayon of Yonah, that the kik, shemen kik, is oil that comes from the plant, the yon, which is mentioned, of course, by Yonah. Wuhu base of sholim. It's a grass that has very large leaves. V'nikra ba'aravi kroa. It produces a very thick oil. Actually, I have a picture here. This is from the Wikipedia article on kikayon. You can see a picture of the kikayon. So you can see it's like he says, it has these long stems, it's these very big leaves, which apparently can grow to be as wide as 30 centimeters.
Doesn't make a lot of shade for Yonah.
Interesting, because the Gemara says, well, look, this is just one instance, but apparently in the Gemara it says that it was commonly used to, like, they would drape this on like an awning in front of stores to make shade. It was used to make shade. It would be draped over. So I guess if you have maybe a big plant or maybe more than one of them growing, because of the size of the leaves, it would actually make very good shade if you position it properly. And Rashi says also that it had a nice fragrance. Let's see. I didn't look at the whole Bartanura here, but let's just see. Okay, so here the Bartanura is bringing from the Sugya and the Gemara. He says, so what's the reason that these wicks are not allowed? So he says the reason the wicks are not allowed is because the fire doesn't get absorbed, it doesn't go into, it doesn't actually burn the wick, but it just burns around it. Gemara actually gives two understandings here, which are not completely dissimilar. Of course, Mesachsechet would mean like to flicker. The idea is that these wicks are not good. They're not good at absorbing the fuel, and so the flame that they produce is going to flicker. And why is that a problem? So we'll come back to that in a moment. And what about the oils or the fuels that the Chachamim said you're not allowed to? Because they don't get drawn up well into the wick. So what's the problem with these things? That we're worried, since these lamps that have either these wicks or these fuels do not burn nicely, we're afraid that someone will try to adjust the oil that's on the lamp, or apparently also the wick, if the wick is the problem. And then by doing that, you're going to cause the flame to burn more on Shabbat, and you're not. In other words, it will add to the burning, and you're not allowed to do that on Shabbat. Inami shemi aniach haner v'yetzei v'anam kaimel and the ner Shabbat. Or else the bartender says maybe he'll leave the lamp and he'll just go out, and we establish that one is obligated to have a light burning in their house on Shabbat. In other words, we're afraid that people will get frustrated and they'll leave the house, and the whole point of having the ner burning will be lost, because you want to have the ner burning in your house, mishum shalom bayit. Okay, let's see. Shemen Sreifa. Okay, Shemen Sreifa is Shemen Shuma Shnitama. But my kari Shemen Sreifa who Sreifa Omeid Shahare Asur Bachila. Okay, so Shemen Sreifa is Shemen that was of Truma that became Tameh. So the din of any Truma that becomes Tameh is that it has to be burnt. And that, so we call this old Shemen Sreifa because it's the only thing that's good for now is for burning, because you're no longer allowed to eat it, and I would even add more, you're not allowed, whatever, we'll leave it at that. Okay, the rest of this is all interesting, but we don't go into it. And then also, I'm going to skip the part about Chelev Mubushal and all of that, because it's not the main topic that we're dealing with tonight. Let's go back to the sugya here. And so we'll skip through this. Right here, the Gemara talks about Lechesh, it talks about Chosen, about Chalach. And here it goes into different things that have to do with silk and Ptilat Ha'edan, Ptilat Hamidbar, Hirogashal B'nei Hamayim, and all of that. Elo B'Zefet. And here's the Gemara says when it says Zefet, it says Zefet is Zifta, which is just the Aramaic for Zefet, which is tar or pitch. Shava is Kiruta, which is also just wax, but apparently beeswax. Tana, so we learn in a bright. Adkan psul ptilot. Up until here, up until Zefet, is things that are pasul as wicks. And from on in, it's about oils. And this is where the Gemara talks a little bit about Shava, and we'll leave it at that. Sulta de Zifta. So let's do this. So right here it says Kol Elu Shamru Ein Madlikin Bahen B'Shabbat Aval Osin Mehen Midura Bein Lidchain Kenegda Bein Lishtamesh Le'ora Bein Al Gabei Karka Bein Al Gabei Kira V'lo Esru El Lasot Mehen Tila B'ner Bilvan. All of these things that the Mishnah says that you're not allowed to light with them on Shabbat, we are allowed to make a fire with them, a durah. You can make that fire to warm yourself or to use its light. In other words, you had to read by it or whatever you want to do by the light. And you can make it on the ground, you can make it in an oven. And they only forbade this to make these things to make a ptila l'ner bilvad. The only thing that the Mishnah forbade was to make wicks from the things that we talked about as being wicks. So why should it be that the things that you're not allowed to light Shabbos candles with, you would be allowed to make a fire with them? Why should that be?
I could repeat the question one more time.
Why? So the Braita here says all of these things that the Mishnah said that you're not allowed to use that you're not allowed to use to make wicks from, that you're not allowed to use for lighting. you're allowed to burn them in a fire. And you're allowed that fire for warming yourself or for using the light just to see. You're allowed to use it in your oven. The only thing you're not allowed to use those things for is to make a wick. So why are you allowed to make a fire from those things? Why would you be allowed to make a fire from those things?
Well, I mean, the fire is not a clay mitzvah. We're
So
actually,
so what?
and so
Wait a second, go back. What was the reason we said you're not allowed to use those things for a wick?
because they don't actually conduct the oil, and so therefore they don't get a steady flame. They flicker.
Okay. So
And
why would you
we do know that the oil is part of, certainly in the Hechal, the oil was, we were commanded to, light lamps with the pure olive oil. And if in fact sort of the Shabbat lights are commemoration and transfiguration.
No, wait. You're going off a little bit on a tangent.
Imagine that.
No. Let's bring it back. So the reason that you're not allowed to use the tilim that are mentioned, the things to make wicks, is because they're going to flicker and they're not going to hold the flame well. And so what's the problem? What was the problem with that? Why is that problematic?
Because problematic because then somebody may be tempted to adjust
Somebody may be tempted to adjust the flame. Okay,
yeah,
so why would you be allowed to use those same things to make a fire?
Because you're not. With a fire, it doesn't matter whether it flickers or not.
It doesn't matter. We're not afraid that you're going to go and try to adjust the fire. If you have a single flame on your lamp, it's going to be annoying if it's flickering or if it doesn't light well. Once you throw these things in the fire, burn the way they burn, however they burn. They'll burn with everything else that burns. And we're not afraid that you're going to adjust that. So that would be the reason why you would be allowed to use them for a fire. Now, the reason I stopped on this, even though, again, it's not specifically about Hanukkah, I want us to be keeping in mind all the time the basis for why the list of things that are brought in the Mishnah are things that you're not allowed to light with on Shabbat. Okay, so you're not allowed to light with, the only Yisur is to light a ner with them, but you're allowed to medura with them. Okay, let's go. The Gemara here then talks about Shem and Kik. And here, this is where it says specifically, Amar Rabba Ptilot Shamru Chachamim Ein Madlikin Behem B'Shabbat Mimnei Sha'ur Misachsechet Bahem. Shmanim Shamru Chachamim Madlikin Behem Mimnei She'ein Nimshakin Achar Ptilah. So this is where the Bartanura got his Perush from. The Rabba says the wicks that the Chachamim forbade us to use to light on Shabbat is because the flame is going to flicker. And Rashi actually, I said, gives here two explanations, but basically that it's not going to be a steady flame, and that the oils are not allowed to be used because they don't absorb well into the wicks. And therefore, as Rashi says, va'ati lahatot, and then you'll come to adjust the flame. So then, interesting discussion here in the Gemara about, okay, so all these things that Chachamim said, these oils that the Chachamim said you're not allowed to use. What if you mix them with oil that you're allowed to use? Would that make them permissible? I'm going to skip that part, because it's not our immediate topic. And we're going to go all the way here. So then Tani Rami Bar Chana. Rami Bar Chana learned, Ktilot u'shmanim shamru chachamim ein madlikin bahen b'Shabbat, ein madlikin bahen b'mikdash, mishum shene'amar laha'alot ner tamid. So he brings this Braita and he says, these wicks and oils that the Chachamim said that we just learned now in the Mishnah, that you're not allowed to light them on Shabbat, you're not allowed to light with them in the Mikdash. And why not? Because it says, Laha'alot ner tamid. So what does that mean? Well, how do we learn from that? Laha'alot ner tamid, right? What's the whole? This is the beginning of Titzaveh. Ve'atat Titzaveh b'nei Yisrael, v'yiklu elecha shemen zayit zach. You have to take pure olive oil, katit lamaor, that has been pounded or crushed for light. Laha'alot ner tamid, to bring up the, literally to bring up the flame eternally. Okay, so how do I learn from that? That these ptilot and shmanim that Chachamim said are not allowed to be used. You're not allowed to light with them in the mikdash.
If it's flickering, then it's not tamid, is it?
Well, maybe it's, if it's flickering, maybe it's tamid, but it's not what? What's the other part of this?
Oh, then it's not rising. It's not.
Right. It's more from right. It's Gemara says, "Hu tani la Rami Bar Chana." But Rami Bar Chana learned this, V'hu amar la, and then he explained what it meant. Kedei shetehei shalhevet ola me'ela, that the flame goes up as it were, as it were by itself. V'lo shetehei ola al yedei davar acher, and not that it goes up through some other means. Rashi explains, in other words, it should, when you set it on fire, and the oil should go directly and into the wick and make the flame, and it won't need any further adjustment to make it burn. That's the idea of the halot ner tamid. Now, you could also say, but wait, in terms of the wicks, okay, so I understand I would need some guidance on the wicks. The Torah doesn't prescribe the wicks that we use. It does prescribe the fuel. We do have to use pure olive oil. So this Braita, the Rami Bar Chana, seems to be more leaning on this idea of the wicks, because the fuel is prescribed. So it means, though, that when you lit the menorah, so we would say at minimum means that when you light the menorah, you have to use you're not allowed to use these wicks that are mentioned in the beginning of the Mishnah here. So then the Gemara asks a question from the Mishnah, to Mishnah Sukkah, that you may have learned. Tanan mibla nichnasei kohanim umehem ayu mafkiin umehen madlikin. All right, so this is talking about the Simchat Beit HaShoeva. And if you ever learned about the missions of the Simchat Beit HaShoeva, they would set up these very tall lamps. They would fill them with oil, and they would take the old clothing that the Kohanim would wear. Once the clothing was worn out, they would take their pants and their belts, and then they would rip them up into strips and make them into wicks to light to light for these torches that they made for the Simchat Beit HaShoeva. Okay, so what's the problem with that? Why would that be problematic? So we don't actually know yet exactly. So I'll just give you Rashi. So Rashi explains to me, right, from the worn out pants of the Kohanim. They would tear them up and make them into wicks for the Simchat Beit HaShoeva. She Bezrat Nashim, that was in the Ezrat Nashim. So the belts, as you may recall, we learned about the belts of the Kohanim. And the belts of the Kohanim were kilayim, meaning they were made of both linen and wool. And dichtiv, right? You'll remember there was a machloket about whether or not the avneit of the regular Kohen was kilayim or not. But at least the regular avneit Kohen Gadol was kilayim, which meant that it also had wool. The Kayamalan Tchelet Amrahu, right? We know that it's kilayim because the tchelet that was in the avneit was wool. Amra is wool. V'tanya la'eli inyan Shabbat. We learned earlier regarding Shabbat. Osifu and shotzemer lifsol. They added on to this list of things you're not allowed to use for wicks. They added on wool. V'ktani madlik. But nonetheless, the Bright says that they would use the avnetim, like the hemenim of the Kohanim is another word for belts, right? They're avnetim. They use them for wicks. So how can they use them for wicks? We just learned from this other Braita, Ein madlikin behen b'mikdash. You're not allowed to use things that are forbidden to light with on Shabbat. You're not allowed to use those wicks in the mikdash. And here, they made wicks that wool in them. You're not allowed to use wool to make them on Shabbat. So Gemara answers Simchat Beit HaShoeva Ashan. The Simchat Beit HaShoeva is different. Why is it different? Look. There's no mitzvah in the Torah that says you have to make torches on Simchat Beit HaShoeva and then to be mekayim this pasuk of Laha'alot that we just described. Beloved, you're right. It's not right. So the Gemara goes on a little bit more about this. Tashema, so come and learn from here. The Tani Rabba Bar Matna, Bigdei Kun Shebalu Mafkiinotan Umehena Yosim Ptilot Mikdash. Very similar to the Braita that we just learned, that they used to take the clothing of the Kuna of the Kohanim that had worn out, they would tear them up and make them into wicks for the Mikdash. My love de kilayim. Why don't we say that it's talking about that they would use came from the avneit? And then the Gemara says ultimately lo de boats, that they actually only used the linen clothing for wicks. So in terms of the menorah in the Heichal, they would be allowed to use the linen clothing that had out, but they wouldn't be allowed to use the avneitim. But they could use the avneitim to burn the torches that were used on Simchat Beit HaShoeva. Now we get to the Hanukkah part. So this has given us an introduction to the considerations that we have when we're talking about these wicks and these fuels. Amar Rav Huna, Tilot u'shmanim shamru chachamim ein madlikin hen b'Shabbat, ein madlikin behen b'Chanukah, bein b'Shabbat, bein b'chol. So this is the first opinion. Rav Huna says, those things that the Mishnah listed, that you're not allowed to use them to light Shabbos licht, we don't light Chanukah licht with them, whether on Shabbat or whether Chol. In other words, whether it's Chanukah during the week or whether it's Chanukah on Shabbat, you're not allowed to use them for Chanukah. So what's Amar Rava, my Tamad Rav Huna? So what's the reason that Rav Huna says you're not allowed to use these things for Chanukah? After all, there's no mitzvah dioraita of Chanukah either. We just learned about Simchat Beit HaShoeva, which actually took place in the Mikdash, but because there's no mitzvah of Simchat Beit HaShoeva, there's mitzvah to make torches for Simchat Beit HaShoeva. You're allowed to use even things that are pasul for lighting the menorah, or even things that you're not allowed to use to light Shabbos candles. So why should we think that it's asur to use those wicks and fuels to light Hanukkah candles? So Rava says, my time Rav Huna. What's the reason for Rav Huna? Kasavar, he holds, Rav Huna must hold, kafta zakukla, umutar lihishtamesh la'orah. It must mean that he thinks that if the Hanukkah light goes out, zakukla, that you would have to relight it. You right, that you have a zikah to it, you have an obligation to it. You have to relight it. And he must also hold that you're allowed to use its light. What does it mean that you're allowed to use its light?
You could read by it.
You could read by it, you could work by it, you could do all kinds, whatever you want by it. But you can use it like a regular lamp. So Rav Huna holds that if the lamp goes out, you have to relight it. And he also must hold that you're allowed to use light that comes off of the Chanukiah. So before we go on, how does Rava deduce that from Rav Huna's din? Rav Huna's din is the ptilot and shmanim that you're not allowed to use to light Shabbos licht, you're allowed to use them to light Hanukkah licht. And from that, he deduces that if the light goes out, you have to relight it. And he also deduces that you're allowed to use its light for whatever purpose you want. How does he learn that from Rav Huna's words?
If you're not allowed to use the poor materials, no, I'm sorry, wait, no, it doesn't make sense. I'm sorry.
That's okay. We're going to, by the way, this is the first day out. We're going to see 3 day outs here. We're going to see 3 day outs. So hold on to this for a moment. Let's look at all 3 day outs, and then we'll go back and take them apart. So this is the first day out. Rav Huna, first generation Amora, very important Amora, says that the ptilot and shmanim that you're not allowed to use to light Shabbos licht, you're not allowed to use for Hanukkah licht. So that's the first day out. Rav Chisda Amar, madlikin bahen b'chol avo b'Shabbat. So he disagrees with Rav Huna. He says you're allowed to use them on chol. What are you allowed to use on chol? What is he talking about?
These other materials that flicker.
Well, okay, the ptilot and shmanim that the Mishnah says you're not allowed to use on Shabbat. Rav Chisda said you're allowed to use them on chol. You're allowed to use them on chol for what purpose?
Just regular lights,
No,
Hanukkah lights.
for Hanukkah lights. You're allowed to use them on chol for lighting your Hanukkah lights, but not on Shabbat. In other words, for Shabbos Hanukkah, you're not allowed to use them. So the Gemara here then says, "Kavar kavta ein zakukla umutar lihishtamesh lo." So Gemara says he must think that if the light goes out, you don't have to relight it, and but you are allowed to use the light for whatever purpose you want. Okay, so something changed because Rav Chisda says he says you're allowed to use them on chol, which is his machloket with Rav Huna. Rav Huna says you're not allowed to use neither on chol nor on Shabbat. Rav Chisda says you're allowed to use them on chol, not on Shabbat. So he must hold that if it goes out, you don't have to relight it, and you're allowed to use its light. Let's continue on. We'll put it all together. Amar Rabbi Zer, Amar Rav Matna, v'amri la Amar Rabbi Zer, Amar Rav, tilot u'shmanim shamru chachamim ein madlikin behen b'Shabbat, madlikin behen b'Chanukah, bein b'chol, bein b'Shabbat. So now we'll just call this the day of Rav. So Rav holds that all these tilot u'shmanim that you're not allowed to use for Shabbat, you're allowed to use them on Hanukkah any day of the week, whether Chol or Shabbos. So Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah, so Rabbi Yirmiyah says, my time of the Rav. So then how does Rav hold? What is his reasoning? Kasavar kabta ein zakuklam. He must hold that if the light goes out, you don't have to relight it. Ve'asur lishtamesh ora. And you're not allowed to use the light for whatever purpose you want. Okay, so we have these three deot, and each of them is apparently based on a different underlying svara. And this, by the way, this is a good illustration. This is a good illustration of what the way Mishnah and Gemara logic works, that a chacham presents a halacha. The halacha, we'll understand, is based on it's based on an underlying concept. So we're going to work backwards. We start with the halacha, and then we're going to work backwards to figure out what was the underlying concept. So what are the three deot? We have Rav Huna who says these ptilot u'shmanim that you're not allowed to use on Shabbos, you're not allowed to use on Hanukkah, whether on Chol or Shabbos. We have Rav Chisda who says you're not allowed to use them on Shabbos, but you are allowed to use them on Chol. And we have Rav who holds you're not allowed to use them on Hanukkah at all. Bein b'chol, bein b'Shabbat. So let's go back and let's understand, why is it that we assume that we understand, or we deduce from Rav Huna? Rav Huna says, tilot u'shmanim that shamru chachamim en madlikin behen b'Shabbat, ein madlikin behen b'Chanukah, bein b'Shabbat, bein b'chol. What's the reason? Kavta zakukla. So if it goes out, you have to relight it. So what's the characteristic? What's the characteristic of these materials that you're not allowed to use on Shabbos? What are we afraid that will happen with them?
They will go out and somebody will be tempted to relight them or to otherwise adjust them.
Right. So, kavta zakukla. So, we understand, why doesn't Rav Huna want us to use these materials, these wicks and fuels that you're not allowed to use on Shabbos? Because he holds that Ner Hanukkah, once you light it, even if it goes out, you have to light it again. So we don't want you to be using things that are likely to go out or have a certain high probability of going out. And also, you're allowed to use its light. So what does that tell me, if you're allowed to use its light?
If you're relying on it, then there's a greater chance you're going to relight it. On Shabbat, it's a problem.
Right, okay, exactly. So it's if you're allowed to use it. So he says, Rav Huna holds you to use these materials bein b'chol, bein b'shabbat. So on chol, I'll be worried that that it's likely to go out, and then you'll have to relight it, and then maybe I'm worried that he's not going to be so, if it's always going out, he'll leave it and he's not going to relight it. And if he uses them on Shabbos, and I allow you to use the light for your own purposes on Shabbos, so I can't let you use a light that's going to be flickering that you might want to adjust. So that's how Rava extracted the svara of Rav Huna from his din. So in the din, we understand now, is worded very carefully. He says, right? Ein madlikin behem b'Chanukah, bein b'Shabbat, bein b'chol. It's important that he emphasizes it's whether it's on Shabbos or whether it's on Chol. So there's a reason for both of them. Kafta zakukla is a reason to tell me why even on Chol I shouldn't use them, because I'm afraid that I may not relight it. And Mutali Shtamei Shora is certainly a reason not to allow to use these things on Shabbos, because maybe he'll come to adjust it. So let's see this also. This is basically what Rashi says. Kafta ner Chanukah, if the ner Chanukah goes out, zakukla, one is obligated to then go and fix it. Hilkach. Therefore, you have to make it nice. Because maybe he'll be negligent and he won't go to fix it. Maybe he'll adjust it for the sake of his use, because he wants to use the light. So that explains Rav Huna. So now, knowing how to explain Rav Huna, let's explain Rav Chisda. Rav Chisda says you're allowed to use them on Chol, but you're not allowed to use them on Shabbos. So why? What does he hold? Kavta ein zakukla. If the light goes out, you don't have to relight it. So what does that inform me about in terms of Rav Chisda's din? Where do I see that in Rav Chisda's din, that kavta ein zakukla?
Since you can use them in Chol, and if it goes out during Chol, there's no fear that you're not going to relight it because it's not required.
Exactly. Perfect. And you're allowed to use its light. So what does that inform me about?
Shabbat, that the fear is that you're going to relight it or adjust it on Shabbat.
Right. And so now we understand, this is why Rav Chisda says that you're allowed to use these inferior wicks and shmanim on chol, because if the light goes out, it's okay. As long as you lit it, you're yotze. But I don't let you on Shabbos because I, Rav Chisda, hold that you're allowed to benefit from its light on Shabbos. And then if you use these inferior things, then maybe it'll start to flicker, and we're afraid that you're going to start to adjust it. So now we come to Rav, and Rav says that these tilot shmanim that Chachamim say you're not allowed to light them on Shabbat, you're allowed to use them on Hanukkah, bein b'chol bein b'Shabbat. You're allowed to use them anytime you want. So now we understand Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah. Now we understand Rabbi Yirmiyah's deduction. My time of the Rav. Why does Rav hold this? Kasavar kavta ein zakukla ve'asur yishtamesh le'ora. So how does he learn that out? How does he know that kavta ein zakukla ve'asur yishtamesh le'ora?
Again, for chol, there's no fear that he won't relight. And then because you're not allowed to use them on Shabbat, that people will have another source of light. So if it goes out, they're not stuck.
Well, even if they don't have another source of light, I mean, hopefully they will, because you're supposed to have light in your house on Shabbos. But asur yishtamesh le'ora, since you're not allowed to use that light, even if it goes out, you won't be tempted, or even if it flickers, if it goes out, you won't be tempted to adjust it or relight it on Shabbos. Because in any event, you're not allowed to use it. See what I'm saying? Does that make sense? Everybody?
Yeah.
Okay, Michael Werner. Okay. Let's just look at one more Rashi here, and we'll discuss this a little more before we go on. Yes, so Rav holds that these ptilot shmanim that you're not allowed to use for Shabbos lights, you're allowed to use them for Hanukkah lights, whether chol, whether Shabbat, because Rabbi Yirmiyah says, because he must hold that if the light goes out, you don't have to relight it, and you're not allowed to benefit from its light. You're not allowed to use the light for your own purposes. Rashi says here, you're not allowed to use its light, because we want to make it recognizable that this is a ner for a mitzvah. We're writing this as a special mitzvah. And so therefore, I'm not worried that you're going to try to adjust it. Rashi is really saying, I think, two things here. But the first thing is, he's giving a reason. This is a reason why you would say that you're not allowed to use the Hanukkah lights for your own purposes, because Rashi says we want it to be distinct that the Hanukkah lights are being lit as a special mitzvah, and they're not being lit for your personal use. So here's where this is the sort of the conceptual part of the sugya, which I think is very interesting. Let's bear in mind that in the history of Hanukkah, right? So I think we looked at it. I remember if it was last year, a couple of years ago. I remember we did a Hanukkah shiur when I was still teaching in Yakar. But the point is, the Gemara here, a little bit further on, is going to bring the Braita from Megillat Ta'anit about what the basis for Hanukkah is, and it describes the miracle of the Pach Shemen and the menorah in the Beit HaMikdash. So Hanukkah is this very interesting holiday, right? Because Hanukkah and Purim, right, are both interesting holidays because they're not mentioned in the Torah. Both of them are celebrations of particular nes, particular miracle. And we see in the sugya here by Hanukkah and also in Megillah by Purim, there's this principle that we want to promote of Pirsum Isa. We want to make sure everybody knows about the nes. But now that we talk now, so that's all well and good. So you might think that as long as I light a candle every night on Hanukkah, I'll be Yotze. But now we come to this discussion in the Amoraim, we see that there's maybe more to it than that. There's more to it than that, because there's already this idea that Rav has, that we assume that Rav has, which seems reasonable. You're not allowed to use the Hanukkah light for your own usage. You're not use it. You're only supposed to light it. So where does he get that idea from? Why would we think that Hanukkah lights are something that you're not allowed to use for your personal benefit? And by the way, of the 3 dayot, only Rav holds this, right? So Rav Huna holds you're allowed to use use the Hanukkah lights, and Rav Chisda also holds you're allowed to use the Hanukkah lights. It's only Rav that holds you're not allowed to. Why might you think that that's the case? So Rashi gave us like a little hints into what we might think, but what else might we say?
Well, I mean, we do know that the Hanukkah lights commemorate lights that were lit in the Heichal, which were not used for other purposes.
Well, and so that's the direction I want to go. So we'll say a little bit further, right? So the Gemara says, I don't think we this Gemara, but the Gemara says that not just that the light of the menorah was not necessary. That God made the illumination, and in fact, the illumination came out of the sides of the out of the windows of the Beit HaMikdash. And so the light of the menorah in the Heichal was not even necessary to be for personal use. It wasn't there for personal use. And Hanukkah, of course, are a commemoration of the relighting of the menorah in the Heichal. So even though it's not a one-to-one match for many reasons, but it is a commemoration. And so it's reasonable to say that when I'm commemorating this, I want to make it like the menorah in the Heichal, where the menorah was not used for illumination per se. It wasn't used so that people could see what they're doing in the Heichal. So that's an interesting point. In the last few minutes, let's just read till the end of this part of the sugya. I think that'll be it. A couple of interesting tidbits here. Amrua Rabbanan Kamed Abaye. So Rabbanan, right? So rabbis who were in the Beit Midrash of Abaye, they said this in front of Abaye, Mishmei de Rebbe Yirmiyah, in the name of Rebbe Yirmiyah, V'lo kibla, and he didn't accept it. So what did Rebbe Yirmiyah say? Okay, so Rebbe, just to read this, it was just a moment ago. Rebbe Yirmiyah said what the reasoning of Rav was. So Rav is the one who holds that you're allowed to use all of the tilot and shmanim that are pasul for Shabbat. You're allowed to use them on Hanukkah, bein b'chol bein Shabbat. And Rebbe Yirmiyah said because so then the Rabbanan told this to Abaye in the name of Rebbe Yirmiyah, and he didn't accept it. Now remember, he didn't have to accept it in the sense that there was also the opinion of Rav Huna and of Rav Chisda. So why should he accept this in particular? Ki ata Ravin, when Ravin came, it was when Ravin came to Abaye, and he had come, as we'll see, he must have come from Eretz Yisrael, right? Abaye is in Bavel. And so when Ravin came, Amru Rabbanan Kameda Abaye, then the Rabbanan said it in the name of, it came in front of Abaye, Mishmei de Rabbi Yochanan. When Ravin came, then he apparently brought the tradition that Rabbi Yochanan agreed with Rav, which meant that he agreed with Rabbi Yirmiyah. So Abaye first objected when the halacha comes to him in the name of Rabbi Yirmiyah, but now that it's coming in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, he accepts it. Amar, and then he said, Izakai gmirte l'shma'ate me'ikara. He said, had I been zocha, right, had I merited, I would have learned the shmaita, this bit of learning from the beginning. Had I been zocha, I would have accepted it the first time I heard it in the name of Rebbe Yirmiyah. So then the Gemara is new, v'hagamran, but ultimately he learned it. So what difference does it make? Nafkamina l'girsa diankuta, right? So the difference is for the learning of a child, right? This is a famous bitui, right? Girsa diankuta, the learning of a child. So what does it mean? What's girsa diankuta? What does it have to do with this?
I mean, this reversal would be confusing to a child. Like he might have been teaching children wrong and had to reverse himself and explain himself.
That's an interesting twist, but no.
No,
No, but you're trying. What's the difference?
A for effort, yes.
What's a biased complaint? His complaint is, I should have, if I had learned it earlier, it would have been better. To rephrase him, right? Had I been zocha, I would have learned it earlier. Meaning, I would have been younger at the time I learned it. And why is that? What difference does that make? Because of girsa diankuta, because of the learning of a child, literally the learning of a child. But as Rashi explains, mitkayem yoter mishel zikna, right? That what you learn when you're younger stays with you longer. What you learned when you're older, right? Like the Mishnah says that this is the only time that Elisha ben Avuya gets quoted is in Avos, right? He talks about that the learning of a child is like when you write on fresh paper, And the learning of an old person is like when you write on erased paper. It's metushtash. It's a similar concept. So here, so this is a little bit of musar, right? That it's better to learn something when you're younger. Now, we're all younger until we get older, which means that as every moment passes, we're getting older. So the more we learn now, despite our relative ages, the more we learn now, the better. So that's what Abai says. Had he been zoche, he would have learned it from the beginning, and he wouldn't have had to wait to hear it in the name of Rabbi Yochanan to learn it and accept it. So now let's just look at the last few lines here. So now the Gemara, okay, so now, based on this, we understand that apparently the Gemara holds like Rav, right? So of the three Deot, Rav Huna, Rav Chisda, and Rav is the one who holds Tilot Shmanim, Chachamim Amru, Ein Madlikin Bahen B'Shabbat, Madlikin Bahen B'Chanukah, Bein B'Chol, Bein B'Shabbat, because Kafta Ein Zakukah, V'Mutar V'Asur L'Ishtamesh L'Orah. Why do I think that we hold like Rav? Because I see this was the learning that was brought from Israel to Abaye. And even though Abaye first rejects it, but he ultimately accepts it. So presumably that's the way we're going to paskin. We're going to paskin like Rav, which by the way is the way we paskin. And we hold both of those things. We hold that if you light Hanukkah candles and then they go out, you don't have to relight them. And we also hold you're not allowed to use its light. That's why we light the shamash. We make the shamash, we make a distinct light so that in the event that you, not that you should out of your way to use the Hanukkah licht, but if you do end up using it, you can attribute your use to the shamash and not to the Hanukkah lights themselves. That's the whole idea of the shamash. So now the Gemara though challenges this halacha based on the svara that Rabbi Yirmiyah said. Gemara says, "V'kavta ein zakuk." Are you telling me that if it goes out, you don't have to relight it, or in minhu? I'll bring a kasha from a Braita. Mitzvata mishtishka hachama ad shetichle regel min hashuk. It's mitzvah, meaning the mitzvah of the Chanukiah, the mitzvah of the menorah, of lighting your Hanukkah candles, is from the time that the sun goes down until the last leg has left the marketplace. So what does that tell me? If the mitzvah is from Shkia until everybody's left the shuk. How does that contradict the idea of kafta ein zakukla? Why is this a kasha?
You could read it as a shiur, that it has to light a certain amount of time from Shkia until the last person leaves the shuk.
Right. If you read it that way, you could say it's mitzvah. In other words, the mitzvah begins from the time that the sun goes down, and it continues until everybody's left the shuk. And that would make sense based on what we mentioned earlier, that the main purpose, and certainly one of the main purposes of lighting Hanukkah candles is Pirsumei Nisa. You're trying to publicize the nace, so you should light it. So in light of that, if what I'm saying is true, right, that it's because of Pirsumei Nisa, so why does this time frame make sense?
And then because these are the times when people will be passing on the street and will actually see the candles, and we'll see this commemoration of the miracle.
Right. So that you have to wait until the sun goes down because otherwise you won't see the candles. So you should light them as soon as the sun goes down. And then the passers-by are going to see them. But then once everybody's left the public square, nobody's going to see them anyway. So it doesn't matter. You don't have to keep them lit. So that seems to contradict this idea of kafta ein zakukla, right? It sounds like they're supposed to be lit for that entire time. And Rav holds that actually, once you light them, they go out, you don't have to worry about it. So that's what the Gemara says, my love, di'i kavta hadar madlikla. So why not? Meaning, why don't I say that this brighter means that if light goes out, you have to go back and relight it, like Michael Schwartz said, that it sounds like this is a shiur, that it's a specific time frame during which that whole time your Hanukkah lights have to be lit. It sounds like that if you lit and then they went out and there's still people in the shuk, you would still have to go back and relight your Chanukiah. So the Gemara is dochen, says lo. Di lo adlik madlik. Just telling me that if you haven't yet lit during this time frame, you have to light. But it doesn't tell me that if you lit already and it went out, that you would have to relight. The inami, or else the shiura. It's only telling me it's shiur. It's only telling me its amount. What does that mean? It's telling me the shiur. What does it mean, the shiur? The shiur for what?
How long it needs to be lit?
How long it needs to be lit. In other words, Misha tishka chama ad shetichle regel min hashuk is not necessarily a specific time of day. It's a length of time. So even if you lit later, it just is telling me that that's how long your Hanukkah candles should stay lit. Right? As Rashi says, L'shiura shihei bashemen k'shiur hazeh. There should be enough oil or enough fuel in the candles to light for this length of time. Mihu, nonetheless, im kavta ein zakukla. But if the light goes out, you don't have to light it. So you see the diuk of Rashi, shihei bashemen k'shiur hazeh. You should put in enough fuel so that your Hanukkah candles will stay lit for this length of time. But it doesn't necessarily tell me the specific time that you have to light. This tells me you have to have this much fuel in your lamp. And as long as you put in the proper amount of fuel in the lamp and you lit, even if it doesn't burn the whole amount of fuel, you're not obliged to go and relight the candle. And we'll just finish off with this. So we want to understand when it says regel min hashuk. So how long, until how long is that? Like what exact, how long? At what point do we say that the last legs have left the shuk? Amar Rabbi Bar Chana Yochanan ad edekalia rigla de Talmudayim, until the legs of the Talmudayim have left the shuk. So who are the Talmudayim? Rashi explains rigla de Talmudayim Shemuma is the name of the bull. It's one of these, I can't remember the term for it in English, but they flip two of the letters. The Talmudai are really from Tadmor. They're from a place Tadmor, which is in Syria. Shemuma, Malakte Etzim Dakim. They used to gather small branches like kindling. They would be kindling people. Umitakvim b'shuk, and they would stay back in the shuk ad shochin b'nei hashuk lebatehem, until the other people in the shuk went home. Misha chashecha, once dark. Mavirim bevatehem or, and then they want to light, make a light in their homes. So people would already have gone home, and even though maybe some people have already gone home, these Talmudai would stay out in the shuk because maybe they'll still get customers after dark when they go home and they don't have light. They'll go out and they'll buy kindling from them. So what's the idea? The Talmudai, they would be the last ones to leave the shuk. They're the last ones there. So what do we get out of all this? So based on this, we understand that the halacha is you're allowed to use tilot shmanim that are pasul for Shabbat. You're allowed to use to light your Chanukiah, whether on Chol or whether on Shabbat, because if once you lit, as long as you lit with enough fuel for your candle to burn for this long, you don't have to relight it if it went out. But it does. But you do have to start with enough fuel that it will burn for that length of time. Now, exactly how long is this length of time? So we hold the Maaseh, it's about a half hour. That would be, by then everybody would have gone home. So I think because it's 9 o'clock, I'll just finish up. I'll show you. We'll just show you this in the Shulchan Aruch, right? So this is in the Shulchan Aruch in Hilchot Chanukah, Siman Tafrei Shayin Gimel Seifal. Shmani v'aptilot ksherim aner Chanukah. Right, all fuels and wicks are kosher for Hanukkah candles. Or even if the fuel doesn't absorb nicely into the wick, and even if the light doesn't burn nicely with those wicks. So that's the way we hold. They're all kosher. But the Rama adds, Mihu Shemen Zayid Mitzvah Min Muchar. Nonetheless, olive oil is the best way to do the mitzvah. If you don't have olive oil, then you should use oils that have a pure and clean flame. Our minhag is to use wax candles because their light is clear like the light of oil. Right? You're allowed to use these even when you have to light Hanukkah candles for Shabbos. And the Rama adds, as long as he only, if he doesn't put into the ner only the amount that he needs for the mitzvah. Because you're not allowed to use the ner Hanukkah, whether on Shabbos, whether on Chol, and even to check money, or to count them by the light of the fire is asur. Right. So this is from the sugya a little bit later on, what does it mean you're not allowed to use it? Even if you just have like coins in your pocket and you just want to distinguish one coin from the other, or you want to have enough light you can count your coins. So even that very light usage is considered to be asur to do it by the Hanukkah candles. But not only that, afil shmishal kedusha, you're not even allowed to use them for some holy purpose. Kigon lilmod la'oras. You're not even allowed to learn Torah by Hanukkah candles. V'yesh mishum atir b'tashmishal kedusha. Some people say you can use it for a holy purpose. And he ends up by saying, "V'noagim ladik ner nosaf." We're nohing to light an extra candle kadesh yimishtamesh la'ora yeh la'or hanosaf shehu oto shehudlak acharon. So, if you do end up using light, it will be the light of that extra candle that was lit last. Yanichenu merachok tzat. So you should put it a little bit further away from the Nerot mitzvah, so that you don't confuse it and think that it's also a Ner mitzvah. And the Ramah says, "Umedinot elo eino agim lahosif rak miniach etzlan hashamash shebehen madlika nerot." In our country, where it's an Ashkenaz, we're not noheg to add another candle as such, but we place one. It's called the shama. Why is it called the shamash? What does shamash mean?
It's shimush, usage.
So what does it mean in this context?
It means that we're able to use this light, and we're able to use this light. Even
what are we using this light for?
For the things that we're not allowed to use the Hanukkah light for, like reading.
So actually, not exactly. I mean, what you're saying is true. But the reason we call it the shamash is because the minhag is that you light the other candles from it, so it's mishamesh other lights. That's why it's called the shamash. It's called the shamash because it's the one that serves and services the lights. Right? So he says, so in other words, in any event, when you go to light your candles, you're going to need a candle to light your candles. So the Ramah is saying our minhag is that candle that you use to light the other candle, you just leave that next to it. And that's better than trying to make a whole, go out of your way to make a whole separate candle that's a little bit further away. But you should make it longer than the other candles. Right? So again, for the same reason that the Mechaber said. Okay, actually that I don't have to go into. No, we'll leave that for now. I think that's it for tonight. I'll just finish off by saying I think that this idea of why we light the Hanukkah candles and how that informs I think is worth thinking about. We touched on some interesting topic. Just first, I think it's most interesting when it comes to Hanukkah because Hanukkah is the last established holiday of the Chachamim, and there's all kinds of discussion amongst scholars about why wasn't there discussion in the Mishnah? Why isn't there more discussion about it? Some people want to say because the Prushim, right, the predecessors of the Rabbanim, had a hard time with the Chashmonaim, and that's true. But I don't think that's necessarily exactly why Hanukkah wasn't discussed as much. Nonetheless, it's a reasonable argument. But at some point, the Chachamim did understand and had I'll put it this way. If you remember when we learned a long time ago, or you may have learned since then, it doesn't say in the Gemara exactly when Hanukkah was established as a holiday. It describes the miracle of the Pach Shemen, and then it says L'shana Acheret, and another year they made it into a holiday. So it's not clear. It doesn't say it was the next year. So we don't know if it was immediately after, or a few years after, or generations after. We don't know. But for some reason, it did come down. The Chachamim did take it very seriously, as we see from the discussion tonight. So much so that they really wanted to understand. They wanted that, and they had different understand. I should put it this way: they had different understandings of what the purpose of lighting was, and ultimately we come up to this idea that there's that it's that the Chanukiah is something that we light only for the purpose of a mitzvah. The mitzvah being, as the Gemara says later on, Pirsume Nisa. That's what we're lighting it for. And we even go out of our way to make sure that nobody thinks that we're lighting it for our personal benefit. And I think, like we said before, like Michael Warner also brought up, that by the time all of these halachot are discussed, so we can imagine that many generations, we don't know how many, but presumably many generations have been lighting Hanukkah candles. This discussion that we have between Rav Huna, Rav Chisda, Rav, this is already, right, these are first generation Amoraim. We're already around 150 years after the destruction of the temple. But one might imagine that by then this became even more important because there was no temple anymore. And so whatever can be done to hold on to the, some memory of the temple and to prolong that becomes important. And so the conceptual issues that go into Hanukkah, I would argue, become more important, more highlighted in the minds of in the imagination of Chazal. So that's it. That's it for tonight.
Actually, that last idea would be supported by how Hanukkah, in some sense, recapitulates to Sukkot, which was sort of the Hag par excellence of the.
What do you mean?
Well, sort of
the 8 days.
It's because of the 8 days.
So there's, you could give a whole separate shiur about that, but yes, I would say, and actually, I will just leave off by saying, so if you've learned the sugya, you may have learned the part of the sugya where the machloka between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, right, about whether you light 8 candles on the first day, and you deduct one each day, or you light one on the first day and you add each day. So of course we hold like Beit Hillel and we add one each day. But what was the reasoning of Beit Shammai? Why did he start with 8 and go down? Do you know?
I'm going to hazard.
You can hazard a guess it's based on what you said.
Oh, basically,
what happens on Sukkot that you start with a higher number and you go down?
Oh, so the korbanot.
Right. So the parim each day you start with 13 and you go down 1 each day, and that's the svara that's brought to explain Beit Shammai keneged pri hachag. It's in correspondence to the Chag. So there is this conceptual relationship between Hanukkah and Sukkot. That's at least one relationship. So that's it for tonight.
It looks like you're still here in Jerusalem. I'm looking at the background.
I brought this with me.
Oh, okay. Yes.
B'kitzur, I won't be going at least apparently until January 1st. If all goes well, I will be going January 1st. But as I said, we shouldn't interrupt our schedule of meetings. So I hope to see you next week. But I will still be in Yerushalayim next week.
All right, good
Laila
night. Thank
tov.
you. Chag
Laila
Sameach,
tov.
Chag
Chag
Sameach.
Sameach.
Bye-bye.
Bye.